At our baptism, we promise to nurture others and are reminded that we are to serve as Christ's representatives in the world. Today we ask the question, do we as a church look and act like Jesus? Our song of justice today invites us to dream of a church where justice is flowing and hope and peace are growing. Where justice is flowing and hope and peace are growing. What thoughts and behaviors do we need to shed in order to make room for hope and peace to grow in and through our lives in this church? We read today from the 25th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. But when the Son of Man comes in glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered in his presence. And he will separate the people as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then these righteous ones will reply, "Lord, when did we ever see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? Or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king shall say, "I tell you the truth, when you did it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters, you are doing it for me." Now please open your hands in prayer as I read a prayer poem written by Bishop Easterling of the Baltimore, Washington Conference. This was shared after the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018, in which 11 people were killed and 6 wounded. It is a modern version of the prayers of the ancient Psalms and very applicable for us today. Uniting God, I do not know exactly what lies ahead, how far we will have to travel on the road of unrest. I cannot foretell the number of bombs that will have to explode or the lives that will have to be lost before we understand that we cannot kill each other into the future we think we have imagined. You cannot hate enough to make yourself happy. You cannot destroy enough to make yourself feel secure. You cannot oppress enough to make yourself feel superior. You cannot commit enough evil to make yourself feel holy. I do not know exactly what lies ahead, how far we will have to travel on the road of unrest. I cannot foretell how many nights will have to be taken away or how much progress will have to be reversed before we understand that we cannot persecute each other into the future we think we have imagined. We cannot neglect each other enough to feel worthy. We cannot starve each other enough to feel full. We cannot silence one another enough to feel heard. We cannot fragment each other enough to feel whole. I do not know exactly what lies ahead, how far we will have to travel on the road of unrest. I cannot foretell how many babies' bodies will have to float on the sea of greed and vainglory before we understand that we cannot bully our way into the future we think we have imagined. We cannot bury each other deep enough to feel alive. We cannot violate each other enough to feel loved. We cannot infect each other enough to feel well. We cannot enslave one another enough to feel free. Before it is too late, may we understand that the call is coming from inside the house. Before it is too late, may we comprehend that the stench, the rot, the brokenness, emptiness, insecurity, woundedness, and disease is from within and not without. Erasing you will not heal me. May we understand before it is too late. God, help us understand before it is too late. Amen.
All right, well, let's have a word of prayer. May the words of my lips and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It seems like yesterday, even though it was over 40 years ago. I was a student at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. Well, not really Dallas, Texas. We were in Highland Park, Texas. Highland Park is one of the wealthiest communities in the whole of this country. Lots of very rich and famous people live there. The one you probably know best is George W. Bush, but there are other richer people that live in Highland Park, Texas, where Southern Methodist University is. I remember it was Monday night because we were watching Monday Night Football. Now, this was back in the day before there were football games on 5 days of the week. Monday Night Football was a big deal. And so all of my friends and I were in the lounge in the dorm at SMU watching Monday Night Football. Everybody but my roommate, Matt Bates. Matt Bates, who would later become Dr. Matt Bates, was, as per usual, in the library studying. Well, we were watching the game, and somewhere in the middle of the second half, Matt came back from the library. Now, I suspect the library closed. That's why he came back. But he was walking by the lounge, and he stuck his head in the lounge, and he said the most unusual thing. He said, I just saw something really weird. He said, I saw a person, poorly dressed, looked like a homeless person, rummaging through the garbage bins outside the dorm rooms here at SMU. I've never seen anything like that. And he walked away. Now, that was odd. I mean, there were no homeless people in Highland Park, Texas. And the people who live there, I suspect, wouldn't take too kindly to having homeless people rummaging around in their backyard. But there he was. And about 10 seconds later, Matt came back and stuck his head into the room, and he said, I wonder if that was Jesus. And then he left. I wonder if that was Jesus. Tom Long tells us that the Gospel of Matthew has been building to this story. This is the culmination of Matthew's explanation of Jesus' teaching on Christian discipleship. In this story, we have the clearest definition of what Christian discipleship actually looks like. And it's pretty simple, isn't it? You treat the least of these the way you would treat Jesus. If you do something good for them, it's like doing something good for Jesus. If you do something poorly to harm them, it's like harming Jesus. That's pretty simple, isn't it? And yet, the story raises a couple of important questions. The first question, of course, is who are the least of these? Now, the early scholars say that probably at the beginning, Matthew intended the least of these to be the traveling itinerant missionaries that went from community to community preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were fully dependent upon the goodwill of those small churches to feed them, to clothe them, to send them on their way with food. But it wasn't long before the church began to expand its interpretation of who the least of these really means. They began to understand that to mean anyone who is vulnerable, marginalized, oppressed, harmed, or being endangered in their life. The least of these are all of those who need a hand up, a touch, a bit of love. But there's another question in this text too, isn't there? And that is, how are we made right with God? How is our relationship with God built? The text seems to be saying we build our relationship to God. Our relationship to God is based upon good works. doing acts of social justice, bringing about change in the world. But there's something deep inside our Protestant DNA that balks at that notion that somehow our relationship to God is tied into these good works. I mean, we have been taught, have we not, all of our lives, that our relationship to God is built upon God's grace, God coming to us. The best we can do is respond with trust, with faith. But it's not about doing things to earn God's favor. There's nothing we can do to make God love us one bit more. So how do we understand this passage, which seems to be saying that our eternal destiny depends upon our acts of justice and our good works? I mean, if we just put a few bucks in the red kettle, sign up for a mission trip to the distribution center, maybe drop some clothes off at Goodwill, spend an hour a month at the food pantry, is that all that's required? Or is there more? One of my commentaries helped me understand this when he said every year, for no apparent reason, he goes to the doctor for a checkup. And they poke him, and they prod him. They look in his throat and look in his eyes and listen to his chest. Maybe take a little blood, maybe have him urinate in a cup. And then they pronounce him healthy or not healthy based on all of these tests that they did on him. He said, in the same way, this passage is a passage that is a health checkup on the vitality of the faith of the person involved. It's a way of determining the depth and the connection of our relationship to God. Now, as Methodists, we ought to resonate with that. You know, John Wesley was once asked about all these people that were being converted in his field preaching. How do you know they're really being converted, John? How do you know that their lives have been changed and transformed? Do you remember what he said? He said, over and above all this, are you zealous of good works? That's what he would ask them. Do you, as you have time, do good to all people? Do you feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit the fatherless and widow in their affliction? Do you visit those who are sick, relieve them that are in prison? Is any a stranger and you take him in? You hear what John Wesley's saying? You hear what he's saying? If we are transformed in our lives, it will show. If we have experienced God's forgiveness and mercy and grace deep in our souls, it cannot help but be seen in the way that we live our lives. We can check the strength of our relationship to God by looking at how our lives express that in the world. We don't do these things to earn God's favor. We do them because we know we're loved and forgiven and healed. You know, it was Martin Luther King Jr. who stood in front of the Ebenezer Baptist Church just a couple of weeks before he was killed and had a funeral service there. He was asked about how he measured his life. Do you remember what he said? If Christ is king, what does that mean? If Christ is ruler over our lives, Dr. King told them, then my Nobel Peace Prize is less important than my trying to feed the hungry. If Christ is king, then my invitations to the White House are less important than I visited those in prison. If Christ is Lord, then my being Time Magazine's Man of the Year is less important than that I tried to love extravagantly, dangerously, and with all my being. If we've been changed on the inside, it will show on the outside. And so the key to this passage is trying to see the presence of Jesus in the face of others. Have you ever seen Jesus' face in the least of these? Jim Wallace talks about the Sojourner community where he lives and works and does his ministry. He said our community has a food pantry, and every week for one day we open the doors and we give food. About 300 families will show up to get food, and they need it to get through that next week. He said every week before we begin to hand out the food, we have a prayer with all the volunteers that are there. Usually it's Mary Glover who says the prayer. Mary is a 60-year-old African-American woman who knows what it is to be poor, and she is by far our best prayer, he said. And her prayer goes something like this: Dear God, thank you for this fine day to serve you. And then she says, and we know that you will be in this line today. Help us to serve you well. You ever seen the face of Jesus? And those who need your touch? It's not always easy. Sometimes Jesus invites us to love people we can hardly even stand. Anne Lamott, in her book Traveling Mercies, talks about this little Presbyterian church in California that she attended. She ended up there, and it changed her life. It got her off of drugs. It began this deep and profound relationship with the Christian faith. It's a predominantly African-American little Presbyterian church. And she said, for a while we had a man by the name of Ken who worshiped with us. Ken started coming with his partner, and they both had AIDS. His partner died very shortly after they first came, but Ken continued to worship with us, but you could see he was dying of AIDS. In the choir, we had this large, gregarious African-American woman by the name of Renola. Renola was a sight to behold. But Renola had been raised in a Baptist church in the South, and she had been taught that people like Ken were an abomination. You could see her looking out of the corner of her eye, not sure what to do about Ken. But one day we stood to sing His Eye is on the Sparrow. Everybody but Ken stood. His eye is on the sparrow, but I know he watches me. Why should I feel discouraged? Why do the shadows fall? And as we sang that beautiful old gospel hymn, you could see something break in Renola. Tears came down her face. She got out of the choir loft and made her way around and sat next to Ken and wrapped her arms around him. Together they cried. Sometimes we're invited to love people that we have a hard time liking. But if we look close enough, we will see the face of Jesus. But our passage for today is a judgment passage. Did you hear that? Did you hear what he was reading to? This is a passage about judgment. And I have a confession to make. I am really good at using Matthew 25 to judge other people. I'm not sure it has anything to say to me. I mean, I vote the right way. I follow the right people on Facebook and Substack and Threads. I have a collection of wicked memes that point out the hypocrisy of those people, to point out the cruelty of those people, who point out how far from being Christian those people really are. I can use Matthew 25 as a bludgeon to beat those people into submission who do not see the world the way I see it. It is a light that I use to shine on their cruelty and hypocrisy. But it's not just a light. It's a mirror. And when you look at yourself in the mirror of Matthew 25, what do you see? Could anyone tell from the way you live your life, the way you spend your money, the way you extend your passions, that you see in the least of these the very presence of Jesus? Or what about the church? This congregation, or any congregation of the church. When you look at it, can you see that this congregation sees in the least of these the very presence of Jesus? You can test the health, the strength, the relationship with God by using this as a mirror and not just as a light, as a way to hold ourselves up to the light of Christ and not use it as a bludgeon on other people. This passage requires us to ask ourselves as a church, are we being faithful? One of the things about being a guest preacher is I don't know your story. And I don't know how involved this congregation has been in the politics of the Methodist Church over the last decade. But I can tell you I've been pretty involved. I was elected to General Conference back in 2015. In fact, head of the delegation of the Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Methodist Church. And I remember going to General Conference in 2016 and the sadness and the pain that I felt as discriminatory language and punitive actions were kept in and put in and added to the book of discipline. I was there in the General Conference when the delegates stood up to the bishops and said, do something, lead us. And I was there in 2019 when we had this called session of General Conference in St. Louis, Missouri. Some of you remember that? We thought maybe now. Maybe now we can get this fully inclusive, generous, United Methodist Church that God wants us to be. We can get it now. And we had our first vote, and we knew it wasn't going to happen. About 18 votes short of being the church that I envisioned God wanting us to be. That night, we met in the basement of a church, a number of the leaders. There was a lot of sadness and a lot of anger, kind of directed towards each other. And finally, this woman stood up and she says, we have forgotten why we're here. We have forgotten what it means to be the church. And she told a story that I'll never forget. She said, I was raised in a large Italian family out east somewhere. And the family holidays were big deals. We would all get together, especially Thanksgiving. The whole family would get together for a big meal. And we always did it at my grandmother's house, which was strange because she had this tiny little house that really wasn't big enough for the whole family. But it was grandmother's, and so that's where we went on Thanksgiving. She said in our family we had a rather sort of traditional division of labor. The women would be in this small kitchen of my grandmother's cooking and telling stories, and the smell would go through grandmother's little house. But the men all came in with hammers and screwdrivers and sawhorses. And they began to take grandmother's doors off the hinges and making tables on the sawhorses from one end of the house to the other. And we'd all bring in our mismatched dishes, silverware, glasses, napkins. We'd set this table with room for everyone. The couple that just got married and the guy that just got out of jail. The couple doing well and the ones that didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. The gay cousin and the one who married the black man. They all had a place at the table. And when grandmother would say the Thanksgiving Day prayer, we knew we were one family. And then she said, "Church, we have one job. Our job is to knock the doors off the hinges and to set a table big enough for everyone." Our job is to knock those doors off the hinges and set a table big enough for everyone. "40 years ago, I believe my friend Matt saw the face of Jesus. Do you?